Welcome back. The critique today focuses on excerpts from Yossi Dagan's speech at Mar-a-Lago, specifically that moment he contrasted an Arabic copy of Mein Kampf with the Tanakh to argue for sovereignty in Judea and Samaria.
And we should just jump right in.
Because that opening sequence, it's just immediately captivating.
It really is.
The staging of the speech, displaying that copy of Mein Kampf they found right next to the Tanakh, and then declaring their values are Mein Kampf, ours are the Tanakh. I mean, it's such a rhetorically powerful move.
It sets the stakes as high as they can possibly.
Exactly. This isn't a land dispute. It's an ideological war. It's civilization versus nihilism, right from the start.
That stark moral contrast is fantastic. It grabs you, it establishes this emotional justification for everything that follows. But that rhetorical power, which is based on a very specific artifact from Gaza, it creates a really high hurdle for the next part of the speech. The strategic use of the Mein Kampf artifact is a rhetorically brilliant opening, but the material needs to explicitly bridge this powerful, specific evidence of ideological warfare to the proposed political action, Judea and Samaria sovereignty.
So the ideological threat is crystal clear, but the logical map to the solution needs to be, what, stronger?
Exactly. The weakness right now is that the speech uses the Mein Kampf discovery, this tangible, specific proof of hatred from Gaza, to define the enemy. But then the pivot to sovereignty in Judea and Samaria, well, it risks leaving a logical chasm.
Right.
The audience gets the moral urgency, but the argument just leans on that emotional impact, It doesn't quite define how sovereignty in the West Bank is the direct, necessary answer to the threat shown by that artifact from Gaza.
I see that. And if the most compelling evidence comes from Gaza, the policy demand needs to feel like the perfect, inevitable counterpunch.
Yes.
If you don't bridge that gap, a purely analytical listener might just ask, okay, if the problem is indoctrination in Gaza, why is the solution sovereignty over here in Judea and Samaria? It feels like the speech assumes the audience already gets the connection.
And you just can't make that assumption if you want maximum impact. The emotional appeal is there, but the intellectual connection, it needs some fortification. So the suggestion is to introduce a brief but really potent contextual bridge.
Okay.
One that defines sovereignty over Judea and Samaria as the essential defense of the values the Tanakh represents. That makes it the strategic heartland of this entire ideological fight. It makes the argument feel whole, not like two brilliant but disconnected halves.
I like that phrasing, strategic heartland. How do you weave that in without, killing the dramatic pacing?
It's about framing the geography. It's not just contested territory. It's the foundational location for the very values being defended. So, for example, the speaker could define sovereignty as more than a political move. It's about securing the historical land from which the Tanakh's values originate. That makes it a complete, irreversible rejection of the nihilism that Mein Kampf embodies. It makes the geography both sacred and strategic.
That's strong. Yeah, that turns a political act into a statement about historical destiny, and it links it directly back to the Tanakh.
And here's another way to put it. You explicitly frame claiming sovereignty as the ultimate strategic countermove to the indoctrination happening in Gaza. You say, if their ideology is taught to kids in Gaza, then our establishing sovereignty is the strategic act that proves their education will fail.
It's the antidote.
It is the direct antidote to the cultural warfare Dagan just presented. It locks the logic down completely.
That definitely maximizes the impact of that artifact. Okay, let's pivot to a related point here, audience alignment.
Right.
This speech was delivered to a room packed with international policy heavyweights. You've got members of Congress, Parliament, global leaders, and the policy ask was wrapped in this theological mandate. He says sovereignty is not only political recognition, this is a recognition of God.
A profoundly spiritual call.
Exactly.
And it is incredibly powerful for the core base, for anyone who understands the deep spiritual significance of the land, no question. But we have to remember the policy audience. They're operating on a different metric. So while the spiritual affirmation that sovereignty is a recognition of God deeply resonates with that core base, the material really needs to more explicitly translate this theological imperative into concrete strategic geopolitical benefits for an audience of international policymakers.
Okay, but can I push back on that for just a second?
Please.
Isn't that spiritual conviction, that unshakable faith in destiny, isn't that the whole point of the speech, especially given the threat he just presented?
It is a critical tension. You're absolutely right.
I mean, if you overly secularize the argument, aren't you risking losing the unique, non-negotiable emotional power that Dagan is aiming for?
You are, and we absolutely cannot lose that spiritual core. But the weakness is that relying too heavily on the spiritual argument, well, it might unintentionally limit the ability of those international leaders to actually take practical steps. They can applaud the theology, but they can't vote on it in their capital. International politicians, they need a clear, secular rationale that aligns with their own strategic interests. Things like regional stability, counterterrorism, mutual security. They need that to push for tangible action, like recognizing sovereignty.
So the speech needs to give them the talking points they can use back home, a policy brief married to the spiritual declaration.
Precisely. They need both. The material right now focuses so strongly on the theological destiny, but less on the immediate, shared strategic math.
Okay.
So the suggestion is to integrate the spiritual call with clear strategic benefits, frame sovereignty as an essential factor for regional stability. You link the biblical connection to shared Western democratic value. You're basically giving the congressman a usable non-spiritual justification that elevates the whole policy.
So how do you do that? How do you marry the biblical message with the security bullet points they can take back to Capitol Hill, all within the flow of the speech?
It needs a swift transition. Right after that spiritual high point, for example, right after declaring sovereignty as recognition of God, he should pivot to practical reality. He could frame achieving sovereignty as crucial for regional stability.
Okay.
You present the Jewish presence in Judea and Samaria as an established, reliable, democratic partner, one committed to rule of law, against the backdrop of the extremist threat he just showed with the Kampf evidence. That speaks directly to the international audience's self-interest.
Right, preventing chaos, establishing robust alliances, that works. It leverages the moral high ground he just established and directs it into practical foreign policy.
Or consider this. Transition from the spiritual declaration to a specific policy point. Argue that sovereignty solidifies control over key security zones, which fundamentally serves the counterterrorism goals of the international partners right there in the room. That gives the faith argument immediate pragmatic weight for global security. It transforms a destiny argument into a shared security objective.
That's a great example. It translates recognition of God into recognition of strategic defense requirements. Okay, moving to our third and final point, which is all about maximizing the rhetorical finish.
The conclusion.
Yeah, the speech concludes with this promise of resilience, of growth, building more communities, paving more roads, bringing more Jews to the land. It's a classic, determined, optimistic note.
It is a powerful rally, for sure, but structurally, it's a missed opportunity to complete the circuit he established at the very beginning.
Okay.
The concluding promise of building and strength is powerful, but maximizing the rhetorical impact requires explicitly structuring these acts of creation as the direct and tangible rejection of the ideology presented at the beginning of the speech.
It reminds me of that classic speech pattern where you present the crisis, then immediately present the solution. But here, the solution needs a better map back to the opening statement.
Exactly right. The weakness is that the conclusion, with its promises of development, it functions as a strong internal rallying cry, but it's rhetorically disconnected from that stark Kampf versus Tanakh dichotomy.
It just feels like a list of achievements.
Right, not a philosophical conclusion. The material misses this crucial chance to reinforce the whole theme by showing that these constructive acts of building are the very definition of the Tanakh's victory over that ideology of hatred.
So the act of building shouldn't just be some independent achievement. It has to be the concrete, physical, philosophical answer to the destruction and hate symbolized by that artifact from Gaza.
Absolutely. The message of perseverance is good, but the message of constructive triumph is so much better, so much more resonant, especially paired with that opening. The suggestion is to structure the conclusion to contrast these practical acts of development, building, paving, as the concrete, lived response to the nihilism of the opposing ideology. You use the theme of creation to counter their theme of annihilation. It completes that dramatic loop.
That offers a really powerful symmetry. It ties the beginning and end together beautifully. How can his language reflect that contrast sharply in those final moments?
Well, we have to reframe the promise with a very deliberate, active contrast. Instead of just listing future building efforts, he could say something like, where their ideology offers only hate and destruction, evidenced by the vile texts in their school, we respond with the immediate construction of homes and the creation of life.
I like that.
Where they seek to sow division, we pave roads for connection and growth. It immediately contextualizes all the building as an ideological act of resistance and ultimately of victory.
I think that's crucial for the pacing, too. It ensures the audience carries that central theme all the way through to the final applause. And speaking of the audience, the material notes that American leaders signed a declaration of support at the event. That seems like a key detail to reinforce this.
It is. The mention of their support has to be explicitly tied back to this ideological conflict. Frame their action not just as, recognizing a deep historical connection, but as actively endorsing the Tanakh's constructive values over the antagonistic ideology Dagan presented. That gives the signatories' action a universal resonance. It makes them active participants in the ideological victory. It's the perfect bow on the package.
This has been a deeply focused and, I think, very productive critique. It's all aimed at maximizing the policy impact and rhetorical tightness of what is already a powerful presentation.
Absolutely. We focused on 3 high-leverage opportunities here, all designed to turn a high-impact rally into an unimpeachable policy argument.
First, strengthening that logical bridge between the Mein Kampf artifact and the political solution of sovereignty, ensuring the territory is seen as the strategic heartland of the ideological defense.
Second, the necessity of translating that deeply moving theological call that sovereignty is a recognition of God into concrete, actionable policy language that really addresses the strategic interests of those international leaders.
And finally, reinforcing the conclusion, making sure those promised acts of growth and building are explicitly framed as the ultimate constructive ideological victory over the threat, creating a really satisfying thematic loop.
These are all strategic, actionable adjustments. They're designed to maximize the argument's policy impact, ensuring that the urgency and the moral clarity of the message translate directly into actionable support. We encourage you to integrate these suggestions and submit the material back in for us to review how that strengthened flow lands.